your phone. Great, that'd be good. Good morning. My name is Ken Jocelyn. I'm a member of the Westminster Presbyterian Church Social Justice Task Force, and we shepherd the forums. And of course, there's a lot of other things that go on within Faith in Action at the church. Plenty of places to get involved. Before I introduce our speaker, our forums have a theme each year, and our theme this year is investing in each other's future. And through the forums, we hope to learn about opportunities for engagement and action for Westminster members that will ensure that all of our members thrive. Not our members, forgive me, our community, as well as our church members. And we hope to better understand the structures and systems that have failed many of our members and find ways to work together to build better communities. So this morning, Ed Ehlinger is going to be our presenter. He is a physician, public health oriented, I think, all of your life. He describes himself as a public health metaphysician, and he is former commissioner of health for Minnesota and presently serves as chair for the Health and Human Services Secretary's Committee on Infant and Maternal Mortality, and that's federal HHS, right? And his topic this morning is changing the narrative to address today's existential challenges, which is wonderful. So I'm going to let you say more. Ed and I have known each other off and on over the years, and it's wonderful to have you here. There will be questions at the end, time for questions, and if you're here in the room, raise your hand so we can give you the microphone. Otherwise, people live will not be able to hear it. This is also being recorded in an archive, so those questions are often some of the most powerful things. If you're online, you can put questions in the chat. We'll monitor them.
Oh, you should probably be saying that here.
Oh. If you're online, put your questions in the chat, and we'll bring them forward. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It is just a pleasure to be here. And I love the fact that you're a social justice forum. And I love the theme that you've got in investigate each other's futures, because I think that we are actually colleagues in this effort because we're working together. So I see you here as partners, as collaborators, as colleagues in the work that needs to be done. And the reason I say that is because if you look at the definition of public health is what we as a society do collectively to assure the conditions in which people can be healthy. That's the official definition of public health from the Institute of Medicine. You notice it doesn't say doctors or nurses or health departments or, it just says we as a society collectively. So that means you and me. So we're all in this together. And so that is part of the whole idea of investing in each other's future, that we're all in this together. And then you go along with the fact that with your church, that the definition, well, what you're focusing on social justice, and this social justice committee or your forum. And if you look at what Bill Foege, who was the head of CDC, and the person who helped start the Carter Center, he said, the philosophy behind science is to discover truth. The philosophy behind medicine is to use that truth to treat patients. And the philosophy behind public health is social justice. So when you pick what the philosophy is, public health is not a place of employment. Gretchen and I worked in governmental public health, but you are also public health. That's why you're here. That's why we're having this conversation. And we're working collectively, using that philosophy to improve the health in which people can be healthy. Now, I have to let you know, when I'm going to talk a lot about social justice. And when I talk about social justice, this is what I mean. Social justice is that everyone gets their basic needs met, everyone has the opportunity to thrive, and no one benefits at the expense of somebody else. So that's my definition of social justice. And I know everybody talks about social justice, but I always wonder what they're really talking about. So just so you know what I'm talking about. And that's why, it fits with you, with your theme, investing in each other's future. We're all in this together, working on social justice. And as I like what Ken was talking about, everyone gets their basic needs met. Everyone has the opportunity to thrive. Everyone, not just those in this church, or not just those with high incomes, or not just those in the urban areas. Everyone has the opportunity to thrive. And no one benefits at the expense of somebody else, because that's had led to a lot of the problems that we have. So I was here in 2019 giving a speech, and I never like to give the same speech twice, so I didn't want to go through that. And I also know that Ehlinger was here talking about health equity, and I'm not exactly sure what she talked about, but I have a feeling that I'm going to go in a little different direction. And normally I talk a lot about data. I'm going to give you a little bit of data, but not a lot about data. And those who know me, I usually like to link what I'm talking about to something that went on in history on this day, or somebody's birthday. And I had a great quote that I could have used from Hannah Arendt, a sociologist, who was all about totalitarianism and fake news and social media, but I didn't go there. So that would be good talk for another day. But I'm also, as Ken said, I chair the Secretary's Advisory Committee for Infant and Maternal Mortality. And this coming Wednesday, we are going to be sending a report to the Secretary of Health and Human Services entitled Making Amends: Recommended Strategies and Actions to Improve the Health and Safety of American Indians and Alaska Native Mothers and Infants. It's the first time ever, and we drafted most of this report just last September when we had the first meeting ever outside of Rockville, Maryland, where the Maternal and Child Health Bureau is. We had it on the Shakopee, Mdewakanton, and Sioux community. Had American Indian, Alaska Natives from across the country come here and testify in first person. And I would like to talk about that, but I think you should, and I'll give you a direct, I think you should have that conversation, but it should be led by an American Indian or Alaska Native. I would be glad to come and in support of that. But I think, and particularly in Minneapolis, you have the third largest population of urban Indians in the country. And you probably didn't know that, because they're sort of invisible, except for some problems every once in a while. And 70% of all American Indian and Alaska Natives are in urban areas. So this is an urban problem, or an urban issue. They bring lots of resilience, and I think that would be something that you should really think about. So I won't talk about that, but I could, just if you want, actually on Wednesday when we approve this report that we're going to send, I'd be glad to send it to you, and then you could share it. It's a fairly large report, but the narrative that was in it. The other thing is we only have one Indigenous person on our committee, but she was incredibly important in getting this report. And I know that at the Minneapolis Health Department, you have some American Indians on staff, which makes all the difference in the world. When you have people from the community who are helping to work on the issues, it makes all the difference in the world of how you frame it and how you present those issues. So that's why I suggest that you take that on sometime. So instead of talking about that, I'm going to frame my talk around the speech that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave on the second week of Advent in 1960, second week of Advent in 1964. 58 years ago this week, he gave his Nobel Peace Prize lecture. And you will also, I know in your church service later on, you're going to be hearing from Isaiah. And he talked similarly about same issues that you're in that your first or second reading from Isaiah. He talked about leading with justice and integrity. And he really talked about not using exactly the same words, but investing in each other's future. Now, it's interesting that his winning the Nobel Peace Prize, the day that it was notified that he won, was exactly 101 years after Albert Nobel got the patent for nitroglycerin. And the concomitance of that was highlighted by Dr. King in his speech when he called out 3 existential challenges that were facing the country in 1964: nuclear war, poverty, and racial injustice. Unfortunately, those existential challenges did not go away. And in fact, the war in Ukraine, and the social justice protests, racial justice protests following the George Floyd murder, have identified that poverty and racial injustice are still here, and they pose a greater threat now than ever. Now, for me, because poverty and racial injustice are linked, I put them together into the category of inequities. So when you hear it is and they're linked, but they're not exactly the same. But I look at inequities. And so you may wonder, why are those existential challenges? Well, look at this quote from Frederick Douglass. He said, "Where justice is denied, where poverty is enforced, where ignorance prevails, and where any class is made to feel that society is an organized conspiracy to oppress, rob, and degrade them, neither persons nor property will be safe. Inequities will cause society to be disruptive in ways that it would make society not what we want it to be." That is an existential challenge, and we're seeing that played out across the country. Also, so heed those words, but also heed even centuries earlier, millennia, where Aristotle said, where some people are very wealthy and others have nothing, the result will be either extreme democracy, which is anarchy, or oligarchy or dictatorship. And despotism will come from either of those successes. And that's when, since we have some of the greatest wealth inequities in history in our country, that is another threat. So you look at what Frederick Douglass said, what Aristotle said, these are some of the existential threats. But you also know that we've got a couple of other existential threats that came about since 1964. So the compounding those, we have climate change and infectious diseases like COVID. And I'm sure Dr. King would have added those to his list if they were available at the time, but they weren't. But I also think that he would agree with what he said in 1964 about these existential challenges. He said, "Each of these problems, while appearing to be separate and isolated, is inextricably bound to each other." These are not separate things. They are combined, or they're collective. They are interactive. So today's existential threats of nuclear war, climate change, pandemics, inequities, those created by racial injustice particularly, are inextricably bound to each other. But the good news is that since they're bound to each other, if you deal with one, you're actually going to impact the others. And I firmly believe, from the work that I've done over the years, that your work, my work, our work, to impact inequities, which is the absence of social justice, will impact the other ones. Our work on equity will actually have an impact on nuclear war. Our work on social justice and inequities will actually impact climate change, because those are the things that we need, the community connection. But you may wonder, how are they connected? How are those things connected? Well, the roots of all of these existential challenges spring from the values that frame and support all aspects of our society. They are nurtured and supported by a specific worldview that, and the narrative that advances. The dominant narrative that, among other things, prizes rugged individualism and individual rights rather than community needs, that worships free enterprise and free market capitalism and eschews governmental regulations and policies, that values competition over collaboration, that place trust in technology rather than in relationship, that focuses on short-term results over long-term outcomes, prioritizes charity over justice. This is something I think churches really get. You focus a lot on charity and we forget about the justice piece. Relies on intervention more than prevention, which is the medical care or treatment over prevention in public health, and values market justice over social justice. This dominant worldview has shaped our economic and health policies for at least the last 5 decades. The COVID pandemic, just of the last 3 years, gives us a recent and microcosmic example of the impact that worldview has on health. And from that, I think we can extrapolate for its broader impacts on society. So COVID is just a microcosmic example of how this really impacts everything else. But despite what comes later in my talk, I must admit that not all of the results coming from this worldview are bad. You know, because our long-term prioritization on technology and science, particularly biomedical science, we gained knowledge about the SARS-CoV-2 virus really quickly. We were able to identify what that was. We were able to develop a vaccine more rapidly than I ever thought imaginable and get it marketed. And we learned how to treat COVID patients. So I think we have some of the best medical care in the world to treat that disease. So some of these things are really good. And in a broader sense, they've certainly created things that we couldn't even dream about 5 years ago, much less 50 years ago. Communication, all the technology, that the connections that we have, the speed of innovation, all of those things are good. So as Dr. King said, and so I don't want to get rid of our technology and our biomedical expertise, but as Dr. King said, modern man has reached new and astonishing peaks of scientific success and created a dazzling picture of modern man's scientific and technological progress. So we're really, in a new frontier, creating some new things. But we also know that in the last 50 years and our 3-year history with COVID, that these scientific and technological advances have not gotten us to where we really want to be as a society, where we need to be as a society. And here's where come in some of the data pieces. I won't give you a whole lot of data, but this one in particular. I'm a pediatrician, and I focused my entire career on maternal and child health. And this slide shows infant mortality rates, black infant mortality rates in the dark line on the top, and the white infant mortality rates on the bottom line, the red line. These are national data, but Minnesota data and Minneapolis data are exactly the same. They'll bounce around a little bit because the numbers are smaller, but they show exactly the same thing. The beginning of this slide is 1980. That's when I moved to Minnesota, and I got a job running the maternal and child health program at the Minneapolis Health Department, the program the agency that Gretchen was commissioner of for many years. And so for the next 15 years, from 1980 to 1995, I worked on the maternal and child health program, particularly on infant and maternal mortality, and the disparities that were there. Brought in I got a lot of great medical training. I brought all that good medical training. I got good public health training. I got all that good public health training. And for 15 years, put those things together, working on infant mortality. Then I left and went to the university to run the student health service for 16 years. And then after that, got back into governmental public health as commissioner of health for the state of Minnesota. 2011, the last data point on that slide. So I thought, all right, let me look back when I became commissioner of health at the state. Let me look back at the last 31 years and see what happened with that issue. And I was shocked to see that in 2011, 31 years after I started this thing, black infant mortality rate had still not reached the white rate of 1980. In 31 years, we had not closed that gap. And it's just gotten worse, or it's certainly not gotten any better. And if you compare us what's going on with other countries, our ranking on infant mortality has just dropped dramatically. We used to be in the top 10 or 15, and now we're down to, I think we're now down to 33rd in terms of infant mortality. One of the other factors, maternal mortality. We're one of the few countries, really the only developed high-income country where the maternal mortality rate is actually going up. And we're now 49th in the world among high-income countries in terms of maternal mortality, and most of that is because of disparities, particularly among African American and American Indian mothers. And then sort of my last data slide, it's not just about health. These are reading scores comparing whites with Hispanics and African Americans. And the same thing holds true. In those 43 years from 1975 to 2008, the black and Hispanic rates have not reached the white rates of 1975. In 43 years, they haven't closed that gap. So that brings me to the definition of public health that I use most often. You heard the sort of the official public health definition at the beginning, what we do collectively to assure the conditions in which people can be healthy. But this is the one that I use. The landmarks of political, economic, and social history are the moments when some condition passed from the category of the given to the category of the intolerable. I believe the history of public health might well be written as a record of successive redefinings of the unacceptable. And that's what your job, here in the city, in the inner city, you're here to define what's unacceptable. The fact that black babies still die at 2 to 3 to 4 times that of white is just a given, right? Why is that a given? Why is that not intolerable? Our maternal mortality rate, particularly among blacks and American Indians, 4 times that of whites. It's just a given. Why is that a given? It's got to be intolerable. The fact that Shakopee Women's Prison is disproportionately incarcerating American Indians and Alaska Natives, it's just a given. That's the way it is. Why is it a given? That should be intolerable. The fact that Indigenous women and girls go missing more frequently than anybody, and nobody pays any attention to it, intolerable, and yet it's just a given. But it also lack of universal health care, income inequality, food insecurity. There's so many things that we see that are just a given in our society, but they're intolerable, and that is a public health issue that we have to call attention to as unacceptable. So Dr. King, in his speech in 1964, really got at some of the reasons why we're still struggling with these existential and unacceptable threats. He said, "Yet in spite of spectacular strides in science and technology, something basic is missing. There's a sort of a poverty of the spirit which stands in glaring contrast to our scientific and technological abundance. The richer we have become materially, the poorer we have become morally and spiritually. We have learned to fly the air like birds and swim the sea like fish, but we have not learned the simple art of living together as brothers and sisters and family." That poverty of spirit and our inability to live together as family are why we, despite our wealth and our scientific and technological prowess, have done so poorly on health outcomes compared to other high-income countries. What happened during COVID is just a common example. During this pandemic, our life expectancy has declined more than any other high-income country in the world. The racial and ethnic disparities in health outcomes have been magnified. Diseases of disconnection and despair have spiked. Housing and food insecurity have increased. And a public health issue has been turned into an intractable and polarizing political issue. You know, it is because we've lost that connection to come together, simple art of living together as family. It is that poverty of spirit and that lack of community connection, which have evolved from our core values, that have created the conditions for inequities for us to thrive, and they've caused so much damage. Those adverse societal conditions are created by our country's long list of detrimental policies and failed systems. The things that created the adverse societal conditions are racially segregated communities and racially biased educational system, our chronically underfunded public health system, our decades-long project of unweaving the social safety nets. Ed, you're in the back. You worked as a social worker in Hennepin County. The unweaving of all of that social net that we put together, it's been going on for the last 50 years. Our lack of publicly funded universal healthcare system. Ken, you got to solve that, right? Our healthcare systems focus on economics rather than health. United Health Group, what is their profit this last year? What's going to happen with the Sanford and Fairview merger? Is it about health or is it about money? It's about economics rather than health. A refusal to have universal paid family leave and medical leave. We're the only country in the world that doesn't have paid maternity leave. Only country in the world that doesn't have it. Among high-income countries. And then certainly our lack of environmental justice and transportation, water infrastructure, housing, and economic development. Our overstuffed prisons and understaffed schools, nursing homes, and child care centers, and our legacy of racism that has left BIPOC communities disproportionately burdened with health, economic, environmental problems. And these are the leading causes of death. Not heart disease, cancer, and stroke, the things that you see on the death certificates, but the things behind those that really are the cause of deaths in our society. The adverse societal conditions. So even in the pre-COVID years, the United States was annually losing over 750,000 more people each year than for a nation of our income. 750,000 people being died, excess deaths in our society. And it was not totally due to our bad medical care system. That is one of the issues. It is due to multi-system failure. COVID simply toppled an edifice whose foundations were already rotted. Have to admit it, that all of our systems are rotted, and COVID really identified those systems. Experience is said to be the best teacher, and recent events have certainly given us an opportunity to learn. So without a doubt, in the last 3 years, we have learned a lot. In the last 50 years, we've learned a lot. But knowledge is academic. Learning is using that knowledge to change behavior. And unless something changes, the U.S. will continue to struggle with these existential threats that we're facing. And so far, I don't think we've learned very much. We've gained a lot of knowledge, but we've not learned. We've made a few broad changes, but except from vaccines, not much has been done to really protect us against these existential threats. In fact, I think we have reaffirmed many of the things that brought us here. We've not come up with anything that will allow us to best a virus, or turn back the doomsday clock, or reduce carbon emissions, or achieve equity. Much of today's rhetoric has reinforced the strain of rugged individualism that got us here. It's a value that prioritizes individual freedom and valorizes self-reliance. It has amplified the ethos that people are responsible for their own well-being. It claims that social vulnerability results from personal weakness rather than historical trauma and policy failures, and actually believes that handouts or advice from the government are unwelcome or even harmful. I mean, these are all of the things. Such ideals are disastrous when dealing with any existential threat, and the continuation of this ethos virtually guarantees that things won't change. But I think there is some hope. I may be naive, but I think that we are seeing some of the first signs of learning. Because the outcomes we're experiencing from COVID, the morbidity and mortality, increasing deaths of disconnection and despair, they're so glaring that it's really hard to ignore the fact that all of our systems are failing. I mean, we can't deny that. Healthcare, public health, education, housing, transportation, criminal justice, environmental protection, and agriculture are all proving to be inadequate in meeting today's challenges. Their inadequacies are challenging us to acknowledge what Dr. King advises: shift our basic outlook, and recognize that we need to shift our focus from treating diseases of disconnection and despair, that's where we spend most of our money, to addressing the adverse societal conditions who are the root of our problem. It's the same challenge, believe it or not, and the same opportunity that we faced in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and in the 30s during the Great Depression, and in the 60s during the War on Poverty. Dr. King, in his speech, framed that challenge and the opportunity in this way. He said, "We live in a day when civilization is shifting its basic outlook, a major turning point in history where the presuppositions on which society is structured are being analyzed, sharply challenged, and profoundly changed. What we are seeing now is the realization of an idea whose time has come. Yes, we are shifting our basic outlooks." I believe that is also happening today. I'm getting a sense as I go around the country and as I actually meet with young students, are seeing that we need to do things different. The convergence of our 4 existential threats of nuclear war, climate change, pandemics, and inequities, and the chaos they have caused have made us realize that the presuppositions on which our society is structured need to be profoundly changed. It's time for us to move from an individually focused market justice model to a community-oriented social justice model, things that you're talking about. We need to expand our understanding of what creates healthy, inclusive, and thriving communities. We need to create an alternative narrative, a narrative that acknowledges that doubling down on a worldview and values that got us to our present situation will not get us out of it. We need to create a version of the narrative that helped us effectively control the social and infectious diseases of the early 20th century, that got us through the Great Depression of the 1930s, and fueled the war on poverty and the Great Society programs of the 1960s, which sometimes get a bad rap, but they get a bad rap from the people who who have made a lot of money since that time by dismantling a lot of those war on poverty programs. So think about who's talking about whether it worked or not. So those were all times of great struggle, and we're at times of great struggle. So we need a narrative that recognizes what Wendell Berry, one of my favorite poets, says. He said, the community in the fullest sense is the smallest unit of health. To speak of the health of an isolated individual is a contradiction in terms. Health is all about relationships. It's not an individual thing. You cannot be healthy just by yourself. You need community, as we were talking about. That's the reason, one of the things churches have done. They bring people together, they form relationships, they help support each other. These communities, a proper community, says Wendell Berry, is a commonwealth. It answers the needs, practical as well as social and spiritual, of its members, among them the need to need one another. Health, both individual and community health, is in relationships. It's all about relationships. It's investing in each other's future. That's why I love the theme that you have for your series. Now, as you probably guessed, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. probably had a way to do that in his speech, and he did. He offered this way. Let me quote what he had to say. Quote, there is a fascinating little story that is preserved for us in Greek literature about Ulysses and the sirens. The sirens had the ability to sing so sweetly that sailors could not resist steering toward their island. Many ships were lured upon the rocks, and men forgot home, duty, and honor as they flung themselves into the sea to be embraced by the arms that drew them down to death. Ulysses, determined not to be lured by the sirens, first decided to tie himself tightly to the mast of his boat, and his crew stuffed their ears with wax. But finally, he and his crew learned a better way to save themselves. They took on board the beautiful singer Orpheus, whose melodies were sweeter than the music of the sirens. So when Orpheus sang, who bothered to listen to the sirens? End of the quote. Now, I have to admit, I'm an English major, and Dr. King took some storytelling liberties because he merged the story of Ulysses and the sirens with some of the stories of Jason and the Argonauts. But the point was clear. Simply blocking our ears to the enticing but detrimental messages may work, but it's not the best approach, not the most effective method. It's a fear-based approach that focuses on obstructing the harmful input by making it the reason for one's action, gives power to that narrative. However, providing an alternative narrative and a more attractive and aspirational narrative shifts the focus and has a much greater and lasting impact. Focusing on the alternative helps build its power and makes it more effective in changing behavior. So when confronting with dueling narratives, the one that centers on what you want and what you need rather than what you want to avoid is much more powerful. Now, I have partially a personal example. So I grew up in Wisconsin, and my favorite baseball team was the Milwaukee Braves. And my favorite player was Warren Spahn, the Hall of Fame left-handed pitcher. And one time he came to town, to Green Bay, where my home, I have to admit it, I'm from Green Bay. He came and talked, and he told this story. They were playing a game against the Brooklyn Dodgers, and they were leading by 1 run in the bottom of the 9th, and the Dodgers had a runner on second, and there were 2 outs, and their best batter was coming up to plate. So Del Crandall, the catcher, came out to Warren Spahn and said, Warren, whatever you do, don't pitch it low and outside. Don't pitch it low and outside. So Warren said, I went back to the mound thinking, all right, don't pitch it low and outside, low and outside, low and outside. Where do you think he pitched it? Low and outside. And the guy hit a home run, and he lost the game. And he said, I wish Del would have just told me where I should have pitched it as opposed to where I shouldn't have pitched it. And I think that is instructive on what we're doing. And we give ourselves all of these messages that we try to avoid. And how many are bike riders? You know, if you see something in the path, you don't look at that to avoid it. You actually look beyond it to say where you want to go. I found that out in mountain biking, where I'm not very good. But don't look at what you're trying to avoid. Look at where you want to go, and it works at getting you there safely. So we have. I'll give you some exact contrasts of this different narrative. This is related. These are the leading causes of death in 1900 and in 2010. So let me check where I am here. So in the late 1900s and early 20th century, the consensus evolved that infectious diseases were mostly due to social problems. They were spread and influenced by the social problems of poverty, inequality, overcrowding, hazardous working conditions, poor sanitation, political negligence. And the consensus at that point in time, the social workers were really actively engaged in all of this, and moms and women, you know, really changed the thinking, and it changed policies and systems, which led to marked improvement in health and well-being. And the infectious diseases, which really led the case in the 1900s, pretty much are gone until just recently. So I submit today that our trouble dealing with COVID is that we're treating it as an infectious disease problem and not a social problem. And I also believe that, you know, the heart disease and cancer, we're not making much progress in those. They're about the same as they were, or actually, you know, about the same as they were back in the 1900s. And I think that we're dealing with those as medical issues as opposed to social issues. But that's a conversation for another discussion. But so it's this public health model, this health in all policies model, where medicine and public health come together, that actually accounted for 25 of the 31 years of increased life expectancy that we gained in the last century. We gained 31 years in life expectancy in the last 100 years. 25% of those 31 years were because of medicine and public health working together. Most people think it was all about good medical care. No, it was the social policies, the economic policies. And then if you look at the New Deal, just in the 1930s, look at what happened, all of the things that got enforced during the New Deal and the Social Security Act and the New Deal, medical care, public health, health and all policies, which really changed our conversation about the role of government. And then, I really like this one. This is what happened in the war on poverty. This is the 89th Congress. Look at what happened in the 89th Congress. Could you imagine Congress doing anything like this today? Look at Medicare, Medicaid, Title V, Head Start, neighborhood health centers, school lunch program, elementary education, Voting Rights Act, Job Corps, VISTA, Freedom of Information Act, highway beautification. I mean, all of these things. This came about. This is my challenge to you. This is what you need to work on. This is your social justice mission. You don't need to be a doctor. You don't need to be a nurse. You don't need to be, you can work on these things. That's why voting is so important. That's why voting is a social determinant of health. We need our public policymakers to do this. And I have to admit, I think Biden in his proposal did many of these things. It was a repeat of the war on poverty. It didn't get passed, but I think that would have helped. So we have all of this as an example, but with the advent of the germ theory and the explosion of technology in the 60s and 70s and the change in American values, this public health model was challenged and eventually displaced by a medical and militaristic one, which diseases were simply battles between hosts and pathogens, played out within individual bodies. The paradigm conveniently allowed people to ignore the social context of disease, and instead of tackling intractable social problems, scientists focus on fighting microscopic enemies with drugs, vaccines, and other products of scientific research. It was a program and an approach that fit with America's fixation and reliance on medical care and technology. For example, the war on cancer. It also fit with the narrative that government and its social policies are not the solution, but the problem. They're the cause of the problem. It also allowed some people to become incredibly wealthy. And that's where our wealth disparity really started to increase. So by 1980, when I came to Minneapolis, this narrative had overwhelmed that social good narrative, which led to a marked defunding in public health and prevention and a massive investment in high-tech medical care. It also helped sever the bond between medical care and public health. And so when I came to Minneapolis, policies changed, and all of those great programs that the city health department had put together over the last 15 years started to degrade because funding for public health dropped by 25% within 1 year and changed how we did it. Paradoxically, the data show that as we shifted our focus and our investments to medical care and technology, our rate of improvement in various health indicators slows. The more money we spent on medical care, the sicker we became. Along the x-axis is the amount of money we spend per person per year on medical care. Along the y-axis, the vertical axis, is life expectancy. The red line is the United States. The gray lines are all the other high-income countries. And you can see we were pretty much like every other country up until about 1980. We were spending about the same amount per capita on health care, and our life expectancy was going at about the same, increasing the same way as every other country. In 1980, 81, when we changed our focus and put more money into medical care, our rate of improvement slowed, and we did, while every other country continued to grow. They had a much more balanced approach. So it's like I said, it's like the more money we spend on medical care, the sicker we got. Medical care is killing us. And it's not that we spend more on everything. We actually, other countries spend more on health and human services than the United States does. The problem is that we spend almost all of our health and human services on medical care, not on public health and social service. For the other OECD countries, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the high-income countries, for every dollar they spend on medical care, they spend $2 on public health and social services. In our country, for every dollar we spend on medical care, we spend 55 cents on public health and social services. And the data really show that it's those public health and social services that really make all the difference in the world. So, I think it's an Orpheus and Siren type of conflict. These threats, they're telling us that we need to reframe our model to one that's more community focused than individual focused. We need to change our narrative about what protects health and improves our society. Like I said, it's a Sirens versus Orpheus. The Siren song of today tells us that our country will be successful if we focus on individual initiative and free market solutions, that we should rely on biomedical and technological solutions to our problems, and we must limit the role of government. And that then they sing that the health is an individual responsibility and a private matter, and a profit-driven medical care system will rescue us if we get sick. They also sing that structural discrimination is a thing of the past and that health is simply about making the right lifestyle choices. It's a song that we've been hearing for the last 50 years. What it doesn't tell us is that what that song has led to is a decreased investment in the commons and the disadvantaged. If they just worked harder, they tried harder, they'd be healthy. It has increased polarization. It has led to a mistrust of government, blaming of individuals for their problems, an unsustainable overinvestment in the biomedical model, and poor outcomes. Like the sailor in the Odyssey story who listened to the ancient siren song and who ended up in the sea and into the arms that drew them down to death, today's siren song is creating similar consequences for the health of our entire society. So, but before it got overwhelmed by that siren song, of the modern day free market, the life-saving song of the public health Orpheus of the late 19th and early 20th century in the 1930s to the 1960s was showing us how to be healthy. It touted that to effectively address the issues of the day, an approach was needed that required the incorporating values of interdependence, collective action, social cohesion, a focus on social justice and social responsibility, acknowledge the inequities in our society, and recognize the essential role government plays with its policies and regulations. And the public health Orpheus song was that health is both an individual and societal responsibility, that health is created in all sectors of our society, not just in the medical care sector, that addressing inequities and the effects of historical trauma are essential if we are to be a healthy society, and that health is a right and a common community good. And that to get there, we really need to invest in community resilience and equity. So the threats that face us today, the threats that have been clarified and magnified by the COVID-19 pandemic, tells us that the 19th century social justice and social responsibility narrative needs to be revived and expanded. Now, the siren song of today says that we can't afford to do that. But the public health Orpheus answers with the words that Dr. King used in his Nobel lecture. There is no deficit in human resources. The deficit is in the human will. So I believe that the public health Orpheus song has been silent too long. It is definitely needed now in these days of multiple existential threats. The social justice song of the public health Orpheus needs to be reprised. So I'm going to do that for you. I believe that art and music and storytelling are all public health goods. And I'm not a good musician, but I'm trying to build a soundtrack for social justice. There was a soundtrack in the 60s that led to the civil rights movement. There's a soundtrack in the 30s which led to worker rights. And we need to develop a soundtrack for social justice. Our ascendant worldview is causing great inequities, keeping us all from being healthy. A social justice narrative is what we must create. So who will seek true social justice with me? Sing along. True social justice, true social justice. Who will seek true social justice with me? A social justice narrative is what we must create. So who will seek true social justice with me? Today's siren songs please resource inadequacy. So healthcare improvement is at a standstill, but there is no deficit in human resources. The deficit is in the human will. True social justice, true social justice. Who will seek true social justice with me? There is no deficit in human resources. The deficit is in the human will. The healthy community depends on a lot of things. Top of the list is health equity. The ethos that's needed to move us toward that grand goal is who will seek true social justice with me? True social justice, true social justice. Who will seek true social justice with me? The ethos that's needed to move us toward that grand goal is who will seek true social justice with me? True social justice, true social justice. Who will seek true social justice with me? The ethos that needed to move us toward that grand goal is who will seek true social justice with me? Also proves you don't need to be a good musician to just, you just need to be a little bit bold and don't worry about being embarrassed. All right, so questions, comments, thoughts?
Those online, please, you can submit questions through the chat. We're monitoring it. And people here, raise your hand so I can give you the mic. And I'm going to start out. Ed and I know each other. He knows I'm an advocate for healthcare reform. And this has been great. My approach has clearly been that it's not just we need a different system, but we need a different way of looking at it, and it is the collaborative belief that we're all in this together. My question is, there's an interesting book that I read, Upswing by Robert Putnam. And
The Bowling Alone guy.
Yep. who's not bowling alone anymore. Well, actually, that's not true. He never was bowling alone. His book was to say we really can't bowl alone and win. And I love history, and this book takes all different sections of our culture, racism, education, all different things, and looks at how they changed between the end of the, I get the centuries wrong, the late 1900s, late 1800s, when the robber barons and
The
the Rockefellers,
19th century,
19th
1800s.
century, thank you. Wealth inequity was the same. How that changed through the Depression, then on through World War II and immediate post-World War, and now we've gone back, as you pointed out, in the last 50 years or so. Another book, Capital in the 21st Century, argues that those radical changes occur upon major disasters, wars, depressions, that rebalance the inequities of wealth and the way society looks at things. Do you think there's something short of a worldwide depression or a massive war, which I can't imagine now, that will help us get to that rebalancing that you're talking about here?
I think there is. You are right. The things, as I look back, World War II brought us together. Actually, World War II is one of the times when we had actually a reduction in maternal and infant mortality and reduction in disparities because we were all in it together. It brought us together. We had and people, and the black-white divide was less because we all needed all bodies. And the Depression certainly did some of that. But I think what happened in the 60s was the really good example. There was not some major disaster. We had war, there was anti-war protests, but we had the environmental movement came up, the women's movement came up, all of these things, civil rights movement came up, workers' rights, all came about and actually changed. The war on poverty brought down poverty tremendously, particularly poverty among the elderly with Medicare, and so, and reduced disparities. That's the last time we had a reduction in disparities was during the war on poverty, because it was a community-focused approach, and it was building power in communities, and it would have continued except as the people who have been getting rich since then saw that the communities were gaining too much power and actually undercut those programs so that it decreased the power in communities and took it back into corporations. So I think the example in the 1960s is one that we need to follow, and that's why I'm so pleased with what Biden was trying to do with that Build Back Better plan, was to actually rebuild that whole kind of war on poverty approach. It's a multi-sector, health and all policies approach. Medical care is part of it. So keep working on the single payer kind of thing. I don't do, because there's so many people working on single payer, I try to focus on some of the other stuff. But both are necessary. We need good medical care, and we need a change in our whole narrative about what creates health, that we need to look at all of the other social, economic issues that are out there. And I think there is an example. And I think that's why the struggles we're having today are similar to the struggles in the early 60s. And I think that's what I said in my speech, is I think that we're recognizing, God, we're going to have to do something, and let's maybe try to pull together and recreate some of the impetus. And we need to develop a social justice soundtrack, which helps move us along.
Is there something online?
Yeah. Thanks so much, Ed, for the song. I think we need a song to rally folks with. If we look back to the 60s, we had a lot of songs. And so, yeah, let's try and get the music to that one. One thing I know about narrative, or that I have learned over the years, is that it also opens up our imagination in different ways. A certain narrative will show us that only these steps can get us there, and another narrative will show us more possibilities. And it sounds to me like that's something we desperately need in this time of so many crises. And maybe you have a thought or two to share about that, and then I guess we're close to the end.
Well, and that's why when I talk about being a public health metaphysician, I mean, I made that term up. When you don't have a job, I can't say, hi, I'm a commissioner of health, and I don't want to say I'm retired, so what am I? I just made up a name. I'm a public health metaphysician, which actually brings in all of the other factors, brings in art and music and storytelling and all of those things that are essential for health, and actually changes the narrative and changes the perspective. And that's why bringing different people in. And, it's a pretty homogeneous group here, not totally, but, we need a whole bunch of different perspectives. And that's what we need, because it's going to be a new way of thinking that gets us out of the current mess. If we do things the same way all the time, we're going to be just repeating ourselves over and over and over again.
Unfortunately, we do not have more time. I know Ed, he's going to hang around for a few minutes. Actually, he's coming to worship with us. So we need to close up now and say thank you.